Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I'm Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs here at Wake Forest University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic, online, interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Robert J. Carroll from Florida State University, my alma mater. His talk is entitled Choices and Their Effects. Rob's talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And you can ask questions at any time during the talk, but all questions will be held until the end of the presentation. A link to Rob's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation, and I'll post that right after this introduction is finished. Now I'd like to welcome Robert Carroll to the IMC. Rob, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present some thoughts here, and thanks to all of you watching. This is very strange, a little bit awkward to talk into a camera this way, but I appreciate your attendance all the same. So this is going to be a talk about choices and their effects, as the title belies. And the basic idea here is that as somebody that isn't really a methodologist, and that studies difficult processes like international relations, oftentimes from a strategic point of view, I'm really interested in how we can think hard about causality. And when I say hard, I mean, sort of as deeply as possible, given the intensely embedded strategic environments that I'm so interested in studying as an international relations scholar. That said, it seems to me that many of the ways to think about this generalize well outside of the substantive setting, because it turns out that politics is really all about trying to get some sense about how choices work. So by choices, I'm talking in particular about sort of a wider class of choices than might be obvious for somebody that is especially interested in rational choice theory. So I'm thinking hard about strategic choices, yes, and where the strategies that arise in these settings are determined by some overarching structure that relates the agents to one another. But in general, I don't necessarily mean anything quite so rationally sociopathic, nothing quite so robotic. I typically think about this very much in the Meyerson textbook way, where this just means that we're interested in the choices made by intelligent decision makers who are able to contemplate the ramifications of their choices and the context in which they make those choices. And that intelligence is really what I'm most interested in. And you'll see that the framework that's going to be studied today is something that is generalizable beyond very strident notions of rationality, and is able to work in a wider variety of behavioral contexts. Likewise with the level of embeddedness of the choices to be made. So as somebody that's interested in formal theoretic approaches to international relations, I think pretty hard about sort of the deep embedding that is characteristic of the international system. But in general, this can go beyond this to a wider variety of social contexts. And in particular, the building block of the model that's going to be imposed here is a decision theoretic account of statistical causation that's easy to turn into all sorts of different societal walls. And so, there's a very generalizable block here, but I'd like to learn as much as I can about that block before we start to think about the edifices that we build with it. So I'm interested in choices. I'm also interested in their effects. So we'll be coming at this from a decidedly Bayesian point of view. And so the effects that are going to be studied here are going to be largely distributional, but we are interested in statistical causation in the traditional sense. And so what you'll see here today is going to be analogous to what's been so wildly popular and so wildly successful in the social sciences in the past, people would say few years, but we're pushing on 2-3 decades now. I'll leave the interpretation of causal up to you. And so I interpret what's happening here as something that is causal. I think that many philosophers of science would say that we're within some modest bandwidth upholding the tenets of their teachings. But it is not lost on me that the causality is thought of relatively narrowly for understandable reasons, by the vast majority of working social scientists. So that's what I mean when I say choices and their effects. So just to motivate the talk, I'm sure it isn't lost on you folks that causation is important. Open up any of the top journals in any social scientific field, medicine, epidemiology, and you'll learn that people are quite interested in determining truly causal effects. When does X have a truly causal effect on Y? Personally, I think a lot of my own interest in this is less because of a deep epistemological dedication to chase after causal effects, and is more about the fact that it's a hard and fun problem to think about. So most of the thoughts that you'll see are ones that were just plain fun to think, and remain fun to think. And I hope that some of you will agree that not only are these difficult questions that are fun to think through, but also that the answers are somewhat satisfying in the academic sense. I can't not say that the game theory is important, hard, and fun too. This is sort of the world that I tend to live in a little bit more, and I find that important, hard, and fun, that's a good combination of factors, and that's why I tend to think that the game theory has these properties too. I know that many of you would like to strike out the top one. That said, part of what I'm going to try to get at here today is that game theory might help inform causal modeling. And so in particular, whenever I open up Twitter and see one of the little skirmishes that arises there, a lot of this boils down to where did the DAG come from, versus why don't you have a DAG so I can understand what's going on. And I think that the best accepted corpus of models that we have in the social sciences might be something that can help us to inform causal modeling. I'll have to augment the traditional DAG structure for that to happen. But this is my primary motivating thesis, is that game theory can help us know where DAGs come from in a relatively tight mapping from the theory to the statistical theory. So my goals for today, mostly I'd like to bellyache on some of the difficulties of linking counterfactualism and rationalist explanation. So just to make sure that there's no vagueness here, I will be adopting a decidedly anti-counterfactualist stance. I can feel all the clicking of closing of windows right now. I think counterfactualism is a wonderful tool, great to teach to undergrads, great to teach to grads, great to teach to anybody. And it's wonderful for singular accounts of causation. If I want to be able to think through what would have happened if some particular event had never happened, counterfactual analysis is indeed necessary for that thinking. More broadly, anytime we're interested in the causes of a given effect, why does war happen or anything like that, we have to engage in some form of counterfactualist thinking. That said, if I want to engage in rationalist explanation of the effect of causes type, if I want to know what is the effect of a given cause of particular intervention that arose in a strategically embedded environment, I do not have to resort to counterfactualism. And so some of what I'll be talking about today is going to be in that style. I'd also like to explore an alternative decision theoretic approach to statistical causation that sidesteps some of these complications from counterfactuals. It reduces the scope of what I would like to try to say is the arena for causal analysis. This is mostly because there are some assumptions underlying so much of the causal potential outcomes world that remain difficult to identify, if not impossible. And if we want to expand our substantive scope for where causal inference lives, then we might have to reduce our methodological scope about what class of problems we're willing to study. Once we have a decision theoretic apparatus, it's not very difficult to think about how to extend that into a game theoretic one, just the same way that Bayesian decision theory has served as such a wonderful foundation for game theory as we know it. Now look, these thoughts are relatively, they're not new, but they still aren't all the way worked out. These are hard questions. And my goal isn't to try to convert anybody. I'm not really part of this church myself just yet. However, I think it's useful to think these thoughts for a little bit. And I think it's really fun and entertaining, at the very least, to think about this important, fun, hard question of causation from a different point of view. So just to be a little bit more specific, my arguments about counterfactualism are going to be that the counterfactualist approach to relatively simple process is often studied in game theory those counterfactualist accounts are oftentimes problematically cumbersome. So I'll give an example of the classic headache problem, where you'll see that the Bayesian decision theoretic account of statistical causation requires far less philosophical and statistical apparatus to be able to tap into the question. There's oftentimes more modeling under the hood that is sometimes acknowledged. It's nice and it's important to admire parsimony and to think that we need to explain as much as we can with as little as we can. But if we don't acknowledge those tools that we are using, this isn't to anybody's benefit. Also, sort of the formal counterfactualism that's based on mid-20th century possible world semantics, this introduces complications if we think about social life in a relatively consistent, formalized way, in the sense that it's difficult to know what the metric needs to be able to tell us what the closest possible world is where the cause arises. In terms of the decision theoretic account, I'm building from Phil David's cantankerous 2000 JASA causal inference without counterfactuals, which got a host of replies in that JASA from anybody that you'd expect: Don Rubin, Udaya Pearl, Sandra Greenland. This was an incredibly controversial approach, mainly because of its unwillingness to study those matters where conditional distributions are unidentifiable. David's title is itself an allusion to Wesley Salmon's mechanistic account of causation, famously stated in the 1994 Philosophy of Science, and his 1984 book that came prior to that. So throughout, we're going to be relying on augmented DAGs, so directed acyclic graphs that have been augmented with non-random decision variables and associated interventional regimes to approximate causal models for some hypothetical decision maker or decision makers, as it were. And from there, we might be able to make policy prescriptions based on classical Bayesian decision theory, like you might see in the grouped optimal statistical decisions. And in terms of the game theoretic account, we're going to orient the debate over what sort of assumptions, and this is part of the beauty of augmented DAGs, what assumptions have to hold to be able to obtain causally relevant estimates from observational, off-the-shelf, IR, strategically embedded data, where we know that strategic interaction is so important. This encourages the corpus of theoretical knowledge to sort of move in a more unified direction. In particular, it'll let us know where qualitative work needs to go. What would I ask an elite decision maker if I could? And you'll see it doesn't take very much theoretical apparatus at all. There aren't going to be any free lunches, and while I'm proposing something, the something is incredibly flawed, just like anything else. And so I don't want to seem like too much of a grump. These are just things I want applied practitioners to keep in mind. So first, I just want to sort of enumerate some of these brief thoughts on counterfactualism so that we all have the same point of reference. Then I'd like to introduce the decision theoretic approach as advocated by David. From there, I'd like to extend the model to accommodate interdependence into something explicitly game theoretic. And then finally, I'll wrap up for a merciful conclusion. So on counterfactualism, ironically enough, the debate begins from David Hume, who, if you read enough Hume, this is kind of strange, but in 1754, I want to say, he argued that we can define a cause to be an object followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So there's sort of an underlying counterfactual ceteris paribus thing going on. Or in other words, where if the first object had not been, the second never had existed. So this is stridently counterfactualist. This is a very precise definition of causation. In the absence of any sense about what it would be for a counterfactualist claim to be true, which is why we have to fast forward a couple hundred years. Tragically, I had to cut off about 1/3 of David Lewis's beard for this picture to make any sense. It keeps on going. And so there's two things I want to highlight from Lewis, two quotes from the famous Lewis 73. The first is officially the counterfactualist definition of causation, where C and E are two distinct possible events, where distinction is going to be hard. Distinct events is hard in general. It's going to be hard in the account that I'm giving. It's going to be hard in the account the counterfactualists give. It's hard in any of the other philosophies of causation. Distinctness of two events is tricky. E causally depends on C, if and only if C were to occur, E would occur, and if C were not to occur, E would not occur. So we've got these sort of two if-then statements where there's some antecedent where we toggle it on, we toggle it off, and see what happens. That experimental control is going to be something that's really important here momentarily. But in terms of the early argument, the closest possible world semantics introduces some real nuance here. So the claim that if A were the case, C would be the case, which is used here in the definition of causation, is true in the actual world if and only if, one, there are no possible A worlds. So we're not looking at anything vacuous. There's no, it's impossible to come up with some world, and therefore the claim is vacuously true. Or some A world where C holds is closer to the actual world, the one that we're living in, than is any A world where C does not hold. So that closest possible world semantics is really working hard underneath the hood. And we remember that Lewis rather famously thought that all the possible worlds existed and were just as real as the one that we find ourselves in now, which, at least until physics figures out some of these difficult multi or denseness questions, is almost a theological claim. So close is a hard word. What makes one world close to another world? So I can't begin to answer that question. I'm not sure that any of us can. So just to have a humble approach to it, let's think about a very limited account of what a world is. So you can imagine extending this as much as you would like to, but a relatively naive starting point would be some list gamma squiggly b, where gamma is a game of some kind, an extensive form game potentially. So you'd need players and nodes and preferences and histories and strategies at each node, and which one does nature move at, and information sets, and some behavioral hypothesis. So much of successful rational choice theory in the social sciences relies on relatively straightforward applications of rationalist behavioral hypotheses. These are oftentimes relaxable. You get a little bit more explanation. You have to do a little bit harder work much of the time. So in order to think about closest possible worlds on this super naive, flawed approach, we would need something like a metric space where script W is the set of all worlds of this type, so the set of all games, and maybe in a particular class of games, and then some metric D that reads in two worlds and spits out a positive number to let us know how far apart those two worlds are. And this is really the only way that we'd be able to discern one world from another. This criticism is not unique. If you open up sort of like, if you keep reading in the Stanford Encyclopedia, eventually you get to this concern. Maybe not talking in metric space terms. Now, the metric that we choose, right, the D function that I choose to define the metric space, it might weight certain changes more than others. It might shift. It might look at preferences harder. It might look at who's part of the game. It might look at information, any number of things. Alternatively, it might also look at the behavioral hypotheses. And so there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what makes one world close to another, even in this remarkably grotesque simplification of the rich and varied world that we live in. So let's think about the simplest possible game, which is candidate entry, or campaign entry. So imagine a world where there's a challenger, C, and an incumbent, I. The challenger can either stay out and not run, or they can enter into the race. If they enter, then the incumbent gets to make a choice between campaigning and retiring. So now I've got a rooted node. I've got a rooted tree with decision nodes and terminal nodes. So I have sort of all the components of an extensive form game. The information sets here are singleton, so I'm not going to discuss them further. So I've, this is about as easy as it gets. And I've got three terminal nodes, A, B, and C. And so if I wanted to finish up the game, given this imposed structure, I'd need to state some preferences over these outcomes. And so in this given telling, let's say that outcome C, the retire option, is preferred by the challenger to outcome A, the stay out option, is preferred to outcome B, the campaign option. And let's assume that the candidate would like to deter and then would like to campaign, and then least of all would like to retire. So a slight tweak on the usual story that you get from an introductory textbook. So that's our gamma, that's our game, right? So these are all the components that we need in order to say, what is the underlying structure of the strategic interaction in question? We also need a behavioral hypothesis then in order to be able to breathe some life into the analysis. So if I sort of go very naively and say choose what is sequentially preference relation maximal for both players, then what winds up happening is that if we use the backward induction algorithm, the incumbent will campaign if they have to, and given that, the challenger will stay out. And so the outcome that we see is outcome A, that sort of the status quo outcome. And now consider a counterfactual of the form had the challenger entered. So now I have to think about the closest world where that happens, holding as many other factors as possible fixed. And my point here is there's a lot of paths to get me there. If we're being precise, we're going to use this possible worlds apparatus. So let's imagine, let's just keep that world where it is. So that's the real world on the right. So let's think about some other possible world and what it might take to generate entry. So let's for now, let's just keep the behavioral hypothesis as naive maximization, and let's consider the world as we had it before. One thing I might do is I might shift the preferences so that the incumbent is indifferent between campaigning and retiring. If that's the case, I can generate a whole host of outcomes. They might campaign, they might retire, they might mix. And how the challenger responds to that will be determined by their expectations about what will happen in any given subgame perfect equilibrium. Alternatively, I can even flip one of the preferences. I can flip the challenger's preference, and so instead of going C then A then B, they go C then B then A, and either one of those would be enough to generate some change in the behavior, so I can evaluate the counterfactual properly. But ceteris won't be all the way paribus. Alternatively, I can increase the number of options. I might find some outside option for the challenger or for the incumbent. In either of those worlds, it's not hard to imagine sort of down tree processes changing the behavior. But again, now ceteris really is a paribus. I could change the order of play. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. If that's the case, then we might be able to jerry-rig the counterfactual. But again, ceteris isn't even remotely close to paribus. Right, so or I can go back to the original world that I had and then play around with behavioral hypotheses. I could introduce tremples, QRE sort of stuff, so that every node gets reached with strictly positive probability. This in turn would influence behavior. And then singular causation accounts get very difficult to think through because I'm necessarily working with probabilities. And so all this to say, it's tricky. And this is not an attempt at sophistry. This is literally what goes through my head every time I see one of these counterfactual claims. And the real key here is whether or not the listener can rely on modularity, which in Pearlian terms means use of the do operator, where one compels a variable to take on a particular value. And I think one interesting response to that is Nancy Cartwright's 2007 paper, Causality, One Word, Many Meanings, sort of encouraging pluralism of a particular kind, where basically what she's coming at is for every system of laws, variation in the given cause must be possible, and the law in question must yield an unambiguous answer when the exogenous variable has been varied and nothing else has been varied except for the downstream consequences. And so essentially the do operator is saying, let's perform some surgery. Let's literally let's go in and play with one variable at a time and see what happens. So Cartwright thinks that there must be something wrong with that conception of causal laws, and really most counterfactualist accounts. So she tells a story about when she asked a question. It must have been a great joy to watch this interaction. Pearl illustrated the requirement with a Boolean input-output diagram and said that not only could he change the entire input, but he could sort of hit any given Boolean component. And Cartwright reminds us that most arrangements we study aren't like that. They're like toasters or lasers or carburetors or the international system or all sorts of things that are shaded and nuanced and interrelated. So a point that the deep modularity baked into the do operator might not be able to save us. So accordingly, she excludes counterfactualist analysis from her 6 dominant accounts of causation. So all this to say, let's make sure that we get our foundations at least with humility. So the decision theoretic approach and its associated contrast to the counterfactualist potential outcomes model, the idea here is that we might not know enough about the joint probability structure of the multiple constituent distributions. And if we don't have modularity, to play with, if we're not able to have full control over something, which we can only do in a relatively limited set of settings, then there's only so much that we can do. And so one striking aspect of this is the inferences might differ if we impose different priors on unidentifiable parameters of the joint distribution. So if we think that y1 and y0 are distributed joint normal with some correlation coefficient rho, which we can never hope to identify, given that, different priors on rho might yield very different inferences in terms of associated causal effects. So my main goal here is to avoid the problem by focusing only on those situations where I have identifiable quantities to talk about, in particular conditional distributions. And there will be no postulated individual level effects. So there's never going to be any, well, let's look at all these individual level treatments effects and then think about an average treatment effect. We're going to be thinking about this in expectation the entire time with full Bayesian humility. So the underlying problem here is I have a headache. I'm sure you do too by now. And you're wondering if it would help. I'm wondering if it would help if I took 2 aspirin. So we can build a decision tree like the following. So at nu 0, I can choose to either apply the treatment to myself and take the aspirin, or I can choose not to and be in the control group. Given that, I've got two conditional distributions of y. One is the conditional distribution from treatment equals t, and the other is the conditional distribution for treatment equals c. Either way, I've got some expected distribution over headache durations, we'll say, where that distribution might reflect both my own subjective uncertainty, because I really don't know as much about headaches as I would like to, or it could also be sort of the purely aleatory uncertainty associated with the fact that we don't have a deep mechanistic account for how aspirin influences headache. So, this is a relatively general uncertainty structure. Given that, I might make my decision based on my loss functions, and in particular my expected loss function. So on this variable y, this headache distribution duration variable y, I can impose a loss function of various forms. There's a lot of controversy about the functional form of loss functions. I'll avoid that here. And my real question here is my expected value of the loss function under treatment greater or less than my expected value of the loss function given control? And the principles of Bayesian decision theory would tell me to choose the option that yields the lower amount of loss. And so it turns out that what's going to matter for today's account is the nature of my decision, how I came to make my decision in a philosophical sense, and how I can identify these conditional distributions of headache, these subjective probabilistic distributions of headache durations. Those are the main statistical philosophical stars of the show here. And accordingly, I can come up with a relatively straightforward expression of an average causal effect, which is just the expected value of the headache duration under treatment and control. I could come up with my face value version, and where this use of the empty set symbol is to say under observational regime. And so the treatment regime is going to be playing a big role here in the model to follow immediately after. So I've got some treatment variable, and I've got some headache variable, and I care about the effect of the treatment on the headache variable. And so the main innovation from David's account is to augment this with a treatment regime variable f, and throughout, squares are going to be treatment regime variables, where this is an element of T, C, so these would be experimental interventions for treatment or control, a la a do operator, but where we're going to explicitly acknowledge that these data might emerge from observational sources. And whenever we've got the null symbol, that'll mean hands off, just sort of let the process go as it will. And so the fundamental question causally is whether y is independent of that treatment regime variable given the treatment itself. If that's the case, then I don't care whether it's experimental or observational. And within the experimental set, I don't care whether it's the treatment or the control or any other level. If I can establish conditional independence between for y and ft given t, then this indicates that the FACE and the AC are going to be the same. So in particular, we don't want to see an arrow that ever comes between ft and y. So the nature in which the treatment came to arise, whether controlled or observational, and if controlled, under which regime, that can't influence y. Or there can't be some unobserved covariate for the usual reasons, no confounding. If there were a confounder, even if it didn't hit ft, then if I moralize this graph, I can draw a path from ft to y without hitting t. I can just go through u. For those of you that enjoy instrumental variables, I might be able to solve that problem. So none of this is all that different from the usual story. It's just that ft here is going to, that's going to be a sort of our conditional independence target. So if you're a counterfactualist, you're like, boy, this seems like a lot. So imagine that I chose to take the aspirin, and so I give myself the treatment, and I see my headache duration, and I feel like I made a good choice. But in reality, if I wanted to think about this sort of in a structural counterfactualist way, then I'd have to acknowledge there's some error process going on underneath the treatment and unobservables going in on treatment and the associated distribution. This could help tap into some of those aleatory issues. And then if I wanted to think about the counterfactual, I would have to compel t equals c via some sort of modularity argument, and then think hard about differences in the yt and the yc with the with appropriate humility given some of these differences going on in the two possible worlds. So all this to say, there's a little bit of humility that ought to be baked in. So just to give a quick epidemiological example, and this is going to be a little bit complicated now, but it'll help us to see what's going on a little bit better later on when we get to the game theoretic extension. So suppose I've got time going from left to right on your screen, and I care about the effect of two choices, A0 and A1, two sequentially induced choices on some outcome variable y. So maybe I think in the example that this is drawn from, and this is from David and Dideles 2010, so this example is HIV treatments sort of repeated. The patient comes in, they're observed, and we decide whether or not to give them some particular cocktail, which has promise, but also some downsides on the effects. So I care about the effect of A0 and A1 on Y. So these action decisions might be made conditional on some observable data, and we'll call these X0 and X1 to indicate the particular time frames here. And there might be some unobservables where these don't explicitly influence the choice, but they do help to determine what's going on in the covariates. So what I'm interested in is how this treatment regime, I'll just call this sigma to help it map back to strategies later on, how does this treatment regime interact with the rest of the DAG, given the story that the decision is made based on X, and where X itself is a function of U. So the associated influences will be U influences U over time. The unobservables are going to be allowed to move through time, and they can have they can get to Y. And likewise, every given time period's U will influence X. The X's are going to be the observables, so they're going to influence the choices. There's lines from X0 to A0 and X1 to A1. They will also influence the error process, and they could influence themselves through time as well. The choices will influence the unobserved. So A0 affects U1 and A1 affects U2. A0 will also be allowed to affect A1. And then finally, that's the final path, A1 up to Y. You'll note also that A0 influences X1, so we've got a relatively rich structure. So this would be sort of the DAG that we're looking at for this decision theoretic account for whether or not to give these cocktails to these patients. So what we can't have, and anybody that's read any Jamie Robbins or some of the interesting time stuff from Blackwell and co-authors, you'll be familiar with this extended stability criterion where the nature in which the decision is made can't have any unforeseen consequences. So sigma influences only A and A1, A0 and A1. It's not going to have unforeseen consequences on the underlying environment. So this stability condition is similar to randomization. All that it means is, the conditions of the hospital are not influenced by the particular decision for experiment or observation, or if experiment, what particular handle we're going to pull. We also don't want the error processes to influence the choices themselves. So we're acting on the assumption that we've asked doctors what they make these decisions based on, and therefore anything that should be in X0 and X1 is in fact in X0 and X1. So this is where qualitative work is so vital. We need to ask decision makers, what are the factors, so that we don't have to worry about the green train that goes through the middle of the DAG. So given the DAG that we have, you can moralize this self in the comfort of your own home and see that y is independent of sigma, conditional on the covariates that we've identified here. So there you might be able to simulate this distribution via MCMC and come up with some good estimate of the expected loss given some loss function and make appropriate decisions from there. So that example, this is going to play a bit of a role for us here. As we extend, I've chosen this carefully so that the game theoretic one is just going to feel like a minor tweak. So let's think about interdependence of the choices. So two choices were made, but by the same decision maker before. So let's go back to where we were, and let's introduce two treatment regimes with two decision makers. Decision maker 1 makes decision A0, notational choices, and decision maker 2 influences choice A1. And so our question is going to be, have we ruined the underlying structure, and do we have to make any harder assumptions in order for this to work in this game theoretic interdependent way? Note also that for this to be truly game theoretic, we would want player 1's choice to influence the variable in question as well. So we need a path that goes from A0 all the way up to Y. Otherwise, only the last player would be decisive for determining Y, and the only influence of the first player's choice on Y would be through A1. So let's just hone in and think about what we need sigma 1 to do for us here in order for this to look a little bit gamey. So sigma 1, you'll remember in the introductory example, it was like treatment, control, or null for the hands-off observational regime. So if we wanted to make this truly game theoretic, we would need to be able to think about intervention on every singleton valued subset of the S1 that we got from the world that we're living in. So the world we have in will tell us what are the available options. And likewise, we would want to have the empty set for a truly naive observational regime. Or if we were so inclined, we might make K behavioral hypotheses about what to expect from decision makers in these settings. And so given the independent structure of what we're going to be looking for, we can be as accommodating as we want to here at the sigma side, because we're going to be able to think hard about the influence of those choices for sigma 1 on Y, and hopefully we'll have all the data that we need in order to get the associated causal effects. So back to the DAG. So the key motivating where the work is happening here is in the fact that sigma 1 influences A0 and sigma 2 influences A1, and we don't see any other excursions. Just as before, sigma 1 doesn't influence the X's or the U's, nor does sigma 2. Observe that if I were so inclined, I could have sigma 1 influence A1, and that wouldn't introduce any problems. Or I can have the sigmas influence one another. That would be difficult to think about what that means, but you can imagine in a world with multiple equilibria, a situation where we have to coordinate a little bit in terms of what the mutual best response behavior is going to be. So back to the full DAG, note also that if U0 is a true unobserved variables that aren't influencing the decision just prior to the treatment decisions, we can think about that as in part as nature choosing some state of a world in a massively accommodating omega space. So we could have all sorts of different options there without necessarily muddying the inferential waters. And so when we turn our attention to a quick game that's sort of parameterized where the strategies are being named a little bit more in accordance with the DAGs that we've been drawing. So just a 2-player game where each makes a binary choice, and we have 4 possible outcomes, alpha through delta. Once we're in this world, it's not very difficult to think about the associated conditional distributions that might arise, where we need to work hard. And some people would say, roll their eyes and say, you're never going to be able to get it. But our enterprise needs to be figuring out more about these conditional distributions, which is possible when we've thought hard about what are the relevant X's for the A's that we study. So with these conditional distributions, from here, it's not very hard to think about what a strategy would look like if we're mapping back to a game or mapping from a game to the DAG. We can think about sort of, you must choose A, you must choose B, you might mix, you might minimize your utility, maximize your utility, whatever you want to do. We've been relatively accommodating on the available strategies here in this simple game tree, and likewise for player 2. So from here, it's not hard to think about sort of applications of some previous work, which has a soft spot in my heart, where the strategic interaction helps us to draw cleaner inferences, and in fact, it might help us to draw cleaner causal inferences once we've appropriately defined causality in our strategically embedded environment. Look, we're really not that far from what Signorino was trying to accomplish here. It's just that we're thinking a little bit harder about what causal criteria look like in these embedded environments of increasing complexity. So again, back to our annoying DAG. Given that we've got two players, one behavioral hypothesis might be that their behavioral hypotheses are related to their expectations of the loss function conditional on the other player's conditional response, which would be truly sort of fully rationalist behavior, where the loss function minimization plays a key role. So lots to chew on there. So good causal modeling in the effects of causes style, less so with causes of effects. Causes of effects is a nightmare. It might nevertheless inform good a priori decision making by letting folks know how to appropriately learn from data in these complicated environments, which may in turn be strategically embedded. So in other words, we could help Frost Traveler know which of these two roads. They seem so similar. Well, maybe there was some datum that was missing that could be thought harder about. And so we could impose FT equals the one road versus the other road without too much trouble. Game theoretic extensions of this decision theoretic apparatus, which have worked pretty well in epidemiology and medicine, this can help. We can help the traveler even more if, just in case there's some bandit that's choosing which of the paths to go and wait to mug the traveler on. So this strategically embedded environment actually works pretty well for our poetic introductions as well. So to be of use, many of us, especially those of us in IR or other really hard to identify worlds, we're best served by focusing on those phenomena where we actually have some chance of learning about the relevant conditional distributions of the outcomes that we care about, so as to avoid some of these pernicious influences of identifiable assumptions. And this isn't to cast any shade on work that works on these assumptions. We all make assumptions, but it's nice to know sort of what's doing the heavy lifting. So just to remind you, the carburetors that we study think, and every nut and screw and bolt in the carburetors that we study thinks. And accordingly, I think we need to think a little bit harder about what to do without counterfactualism and modularity to save us. So thanks for listening. With that, I'll turn it back to Justin.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Rob, for that presentation. At this point, Robert Carroll is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And we have a question already in the hopper from Ekrem Basser.
Oh, hi, Ekrem.
Oh, okay.
Hey,
regarding the counterfactuals in the first gamma-beta example, do we need a new game, a gamma prime, to get a counterfactual? Can we not think about off the equilibrium path behavior as our counterfactual?
We can. So off the equilibrium path behavior for the counterfactual is what's most useful for these singular accounts of causation, right? So this is one area where game theory is really helpful, is it helps us to think about how what happened off the path reinforces what happened on the path. And that's why sort of nobody questions counterfactualism's ability to help us with singular accounts of causation. This particular event caused this particular event. But once we start to think more about aggregates, it gets a little bit trickier in the sense that those, in order to get something supported in the aggregate, in order to be able to make some claim that goes beyond the particular circumstances of a given counterfactual, we might not need to choose a new gamma, but at the very least, we'd probably need to say that some other behavioral hypothesis is arising on the balance.
Okay. So you mentioned, and I'm not entirely sure I follow the metaphor, but you mentioned the metaphor of a carburetor, which is now appearing on my screen.
Yeah, that's a good-looking carburetor.
Well, these days I mostly think about fuel injectors.
Yeah.
But and then the other metaphor used, I think, was a toaster. Yeah. And I thought about those two examples because those are examples we actually understand very well from a causal perspective. I don't think we need a great deal of a structure beyond what we already have scientifically to be able to understand them. And in fact, we created them.
We created them, yeah.
And so I'm curious about why you think those metaphors are illuminative in terms of sussing out why our current approach to causality is insufficient.
Sure. So I think that we're speaking with a little bit of the benefit of hindsight, and yeah, I mean, so my understanding of carburetors is based on the Bernoulli process. So the Bernoulli process is not something that would have been understood especially well, and only the creation of a carburetor would have presupposed some underlying knowledge of the Bernoulli process, which is not something that was well understood up until Bernoulli. And so my sense in terms of why these are useful allegories for us is that, like, if we had been guessing about what was going on, and we didn't have the appropriate model in our mind for the Bernoulli process, then the reason that we need that mechanism, to go back to salmon language, is that it's the only thing that it gives us any purchase and allows us to make next guesses about what's forthcoming. In the context of a social world, which is a lot more complicated than a carburetor, where the nuts are making socially embedded strategic decisions, it's impossible for us to try to navigate that by making multiple carburetors. And so the example that Cartwright uses with the carburetor and the toaster, she was shooting back at Pearl, who was talking about some soil process, which is just as mechanical and easy to understand, but which was not yet understood, and where, because of that, the associated modularity that Pearl was imposing using a do operator on it paid insufficient respect to the interrelationships of the variables in question. I think that's the most important thing, is trying to get some sense about how the modularity might have unintended consequences if you don't have sufficient appreciation for the entire process.
So how is this distinguished from the recent focus on moderation and mediation in causal processes, which seems like it's a very closely related concern?
Deeply related, right? So the mechanistic account of causation, which has very old foundations, is intimately related to this, and it can come in counterfactualist or non-counterfactualist flavors. Most applications have been coming in a strictly potential outcomes framework, which is decidedly counterfactualist. But no, so you can accommodate mechanistic approaches without having to resort to counterfactuals. You have a better understanding of what's going on with the counterfactuals if you have some good process in mind for the underlying mechanism. But even then, that might require making assumptions that you're not comfortable with. And so here, if you have a mechanism in mind, that's great. And that would allow you to use simplifying tools like counterfactuals liberally and with less fear. Great. In the absence of that, IR, I think you're better off being as humble as possible with the assumptions that you're making.
It strikes me that part of the difficulty here is that you're trying to go, and not you in particular, but any causal inference kind of approach is trying to go to some extent from data to conclusions, although there's a DAG, and that DAG may structure how you or set up your model, but we're ultimately still drawing conclusions about causality based on data. Mm-hmm. And that is not necessarily the only or even the dominant approach among philosophers of science of thinking about how causality works, mm-hmm. where you could take the approach that causality lives in theory, mm-hmm. and data only exists to confirm or disconfirm hypotheses that are based on that sort of ideational structure of causality. And sure. So you can take the position that we never really discover causality. We only test our models of causality against what we can observe, and they either work or they don't. And if they work, we're happy, and if they don't work, we change them. Mm-hmm. And that it strikes me that that model has worked pretty well in the sense that it has actually enabled us to develop carburetors and toasters
Yeah.
and everything else. And so I guess now my question is, what's the added value? Because it seems like this is a substantial investment in technical structure. What's the advantage that we gain from that substantial investment?
Am I allowed to move through the slides? Can I move through
Of
the slides?
course, that's
Yeah. Okay.
yes.
So you can see what I've moved. Yeah, because you have the carburetor.
Hmm.
So I can tell a decision maker what to do, right?
Hmm.
So here the investment is, if somebody, heaven forbid, commissioned me to help them make a good decision in a strategically embedded environment, and was willing to tell me a little bit about the process by which they made those decisions, and was willing to tell me a little bit about their preferences over the associated outcomes, um, I would be able to use data from the past, humbly but reliably, to try to come up with the best expected decision for them. Engineers have faced that sort of thing all the time, and that's why they were able to develop carburetors. But here, where I don't have I don't have covering loss. I don't have anything quite so reliable here, in these strategically embedded environments. Given that, the proof is in the pudding in terms of helping the decision theorist try to figure out what's going on. So that's where I think a lot of the benefit here is. And with the attendant behavioral hypotheses underneath here, I might be able to come up with a completely tailored solution, even if I know that the other players aren't doing precisely what I would have taught them to do in an introductory game theory class. So yeah, there's a lot of technology going on, but just like LaTeX helps you more than Word does in terms of being able to tailor some of the things, I think likewise here I can do a little bit more tailoring in a way that's still principled about how previous data is used.
I mean, let me ask this in a slightly different way. How is what you're recommending different from the strategy of building a model, a game theoretic or otherwise, but let's say a game theoretic model, deriving comparative statics from that model, um, translating those comparative statics into predictions, and then testing them with data? How is your approach different?
Yeah, so I never am going to state the veracity of my model, right? So I'm not interested in testing the model, and in fact, I need things that are empirically trustworthy from decision makers' accounts of how this goes. So the truthiness is going to come from them. My imposed model is just going to be a Rube Goldberg machine that spits out some number that is of use to them. At no point in time am I interested in testing the veracity of the model, or in using the world to confirm anything about the model. The model here is purely postulated and is assembled in a humble way, and spits out something that, the y and the associated loss function on it. That has nothing to do with the truth or falseness of the model. All that is a useful tool for decision making moving forward. So I don't care if the model's true or not. Right? In fact, I would say that the words true and false don't really apply to it.
Well, incidentally, I'm not sure it applies to the comparative static model either.
It doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't care about sort of anything confirmatory going on in this process.
I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation for this week. So I'd like to thank Robert Carroll for being our presenter. His presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share this presentation or watch it again later. I'd also like to invite you to join us on April 26th when we will host Carlos Carvalho from the Statistics Department at the University of Texas McCombs School of Business. His talk is entitled Bayesian Causal Forests, Exploration of Treatment Effect Heterogeneity. You can check out our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about that future talk. Rob, thanks for being here today.
Thank all of you, and thank you in particular, Justin.
See you next time.